Good morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation magazine, asianaviation.com. Welcome to the latest in conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. Today, we are speaking with the new Director General of the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines, Mr. Wong Hong. Wong Hong, thanks and welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you. Thank you, Matt, for having me.
Let me say congratulations taking over as Director General. I know you've got some big shoes to fill, maybe not physically, but work-wise and everything. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but let's start with what's on everybody's mind in the industry, and that's the state of the industry given what's going on in the Middle East. This year was supposed to be a pretty good year for airlines, not just in Asia, but around the world. And then you know who in the White House and Israel decided to start another war. Jet fuel's gone literally sky high. I think it's more than doubled. You probably have the figures at hand. But from your seat as the Director General, what is your membership telling you about their current situation?
Yes. Um, well, if you look at the trend that the airlines have been experiencing the last 2 to 3 years, it's been really a good, positive momentum insofar as traffic is concerned. I guess not just in Asia Pacific, but globally speaking. Um, when everybody was asking for projections into 2026, things were very rosy. We're looking at, continued momentum, building on to that. And even as we posted the latest March figures, which captured just only a month of the so-called Middle East conflict, our numbers were still showing pretty decent, returns. I mean, the outcomes are like 8.5% as far as passengers concerned for March itself, and closing the quarter at 6.2. So, on the back of that, we are now starting to go into the second quarter, where you would actually start to see the real effects coming out from as a result of fuel crisis. Airlines are facing obviously high prices all across, and it really doesn't matter whether you're a legacy or a low cost carrier. It hits all the airlines equally. The fuel spike has really gone up to close to 200. It's come down just a little bit, maybe 180, 170 thereabouts, but it's a daily, affair, and airlines are tracking it, very religiously to make sure that they can keep their operations as viable as possible. The other question, of course, is availability, and that brings to us also some concerns, especially in Asia, where certain markets depend very much on the crude oil that comes out from the Straits of Hormuz. So, there will be certain concerns that we will be looking ahead, and we're certainly quite concerned. But in the near term, at least what airlines are telling me is that I think the peak season of the summer is coming up, and we're expecting, the fuel numbers, or at least the fuel availability, to be pretty steady, largely speaking, broadly speaking. Of course, airlines are also trying to look for solutions. Where can they find better sources of fuel, and not just sources of many, maybe also better pricing? And tankering is also now becoming more and more of an operational consideration, as the airlines plan their operations and network going forward.
Uh, a couple of things that you hit on in that answer, I was curious about, and I was reading this the other day. Like it was a really good story. You mentioned availability in markets in Asia that are heavily dependent on Middle East crude. It's not just the crude portion, but also specifically on jet aviation. There's not that many markets that actually produce it. Is that correct? In Asia, is that correct? Where
Yes. Yes,
so
indeed.
so yes, it's not just a matter of having the raw material, but the actual finished product. There's that disconnect of what do we do? It's just interesting because to me,
Correct.
because South Korea imports X number of barrels of oil, or China imports X barrels of oil, but they may not have the refinery capacity to make the jet fuel. That may have to
Mm,
come from another
mm,
market. Is that,
yes.
can you touch on that just briefly?
Well, it is true. There are certain locations, and Singapore is one of them. Has a large refinery capability. Even some of the refineries are out from the Middle East. They get refined into jet before they come out. So it varies by markets, and the distribution also depends on the contracts. Depends on which fuel suppliers our airlines locked with, and then be able to secure the end product. But having said that, I think you're absolutely spot on when you talk about jet fuel, because airlines consume jet fuel, and at the end of the day, that's the price that they have to pay, and the spread, what we call the crack spread, has been significantly increased. Crude oil has gone up, sure, but then the spread has gone up even faster, and that's resulting obviously into higher costs and operating costs for the airlines.
Yep, I want to come back to that later when we talk about SAF a little bit. You mentioned in April that I forget where it was. I think it was when you released the figures for March or something.
Yes.
But I want to talk about uncertainty, and because that's a big problem. You can't, every business has to plan. And this was a big problem even back during COVID because you had all these different health certificates. So Singapore had one, the US had a different one, Europe had a different one, and there was no certainty for the traveling public that if I use the IATA health certificate, it's going to get me in that market. So people want to deal with certainty so that they can plan for the next quarter, the next half year, the next fiscal year. And it seems like when something like this happens, all that certainty, all that planning goes out the window because then they've got to reposition their fleet. They've got to think about MRO, things like that. How do they deal? How does your membership, for example, how are they dealing with all this uncertainty at the moment? Is it just they've got pardon the pun, a war room going 24 hours a day saying,
Mhm.
okay, okay, we've got this plane here, we've got this 737 that needs to be over here, we've got a 777 that needs to be here. Can't forget Airbus, we've got two A380s or A320s or whatever over here. How do they deal with that uncertainty?
Well, airlines for sure have switched into a highly operational mode. Um, when you look at the two headwinds of pricing as well as availability, then airlines, as you say, are very hands-on now, being focused on deciding how do they operate the network. I think the first priority is obviously wanting to protect the network integrity, meaning you'll be able to give assurance to customers that they are still flying to all the destinations, to as many destinations as possible pre-war, right, before the crisis. But having said that, as you understand, the airline industry is a very low margin industry, if you like. Single digit margins are already considered pretty decent, 6 to 8% on average, right? If you put it across. And you now put on such a significant operating cost, given that fuel has spiked by that much, immediately you would say that, just about every airline would have certain routes that are really, turning from marginally profit making to a loss making operation, which means that the more that they fly, at current cost, the more they would lose. So, airlines have to now think about, how do they make decisions really literally on a daily basis to decide, do they still fly to a destination or not? Or do they maybe cut back on using a smaller aircraft? Do they scale back? And some of them actually have taken, decisions like these to certainly adjust. They still want to maintain the network, which means that they will still try to keep to the destinations. Maybe they would fly less. Maybe from 5 flights a day, they will come down to three. If they were using a bigger aircraft, they can use a smaller aircraft. These are just some of the network adjustments that they do operationally speaking, week in, week out, day in, day out. As we speak. And the problem we have is we don't know when this problem situation is going to ease off, which means this remains, highly operational in nature and a little bit of a crisis mode, if you like.
Yeah, I'm going to switch up my questions a little bit because of what you just said. It's interesting. And I don't think the traveling public realizes or appreciates how thin the margins are that airlines work on. And I wish I could remember who said this. I was at it may have been a Singapore Air Show, it may have been a conference, or I can't remember. It was a long time ago. But they said that the airline is a hamburger and a Coke away from making a profit on a per passenger, per flight
Yes.
basis. So
Yeah.
if they don't upsell that, they're making 10, 15, 20 US per passenger without any add-ons. So now that's why they're selling you a bag of peanuts instead of giving them away. That's why they're charging more. So we understand, but I don't think the traveling public realizes, and then there's the old joke, how do you want to become a millionaire? You start as a billionaire and you start an airline. And and
Yes.
so that's how it goes. But I want to switch up a little bit because I was going to ask you this later, but again, going back, I was listening to another speech the other day. An aviation official said, well, the big difference between COVID and now is we can still fly. Yes. But as you said, airlines or Air India just made a big announcement the other day. They were going to rationalize routes. So cut routes, move planes around, et cetera, et cetera. Again, speaking for the flying public, how does an airline maintain that customer loyalty through this when their favorite flight to Singapore or to KL or to Vietnam or to Beijing, where they used to, okay, that flight was twice a day or three times a day, and now it's only once a day? How do you maintain that customer loyalty?
Well, I think the airlines are doing the best they can, right? As I said earlier, first of all, they want to maintain the destinations that they are serving to continue keeping the loyal customers that are, using these carriers to go to the places that they want to be. It's just that on a reduced capacity, on a reduced aircraft size, would be the first approach. The second point is I think airlines are also having to readjust because if you talk about the Middle East for sure, obviously that the demand has fallen off, by a significant level. The Middle East carriers are still only trying to come back, but I think it's also a question of people whether they are still comfortable, to come back and fly via the Middle East. So having said that, at the same time, there will be some opportunities, that start to present themselves, and that's why you see the demand from Asia to Europe, at least at this point of time as we speak, it's still holding up. And that translates to potential increases in flights, if you like, in the opposite direction, not just cutting back. Certain airlines are saying that in order to meet the increased demand between Asia and Europe, some Asian carriers, have actually started announcing. You will see in the news to increase flights, and likewise, I think some of the European carriers are also looking to do the same. But I see this only as temporary steps for the time being. It's a bit hard to say going forward whether this will still continue, but a lot depends and hinges on the fact that whether there will be some semblance of stability in the Middle East as we kick into the second half of the year.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Asia to Europe because my son is going to be flying home from university in France, and normally we would route him through Abu Dhabi or Dubai or Doha.
Mm.
But I told my wife, I said, there's no way because you don't because the uncertainty, you don't know what's going to happen. He could be no problem,
Yeah,
could be trapped in
yeah.
Dubai for 3 days and all of that. So that's interesting. I want to talk too about the rationalization of flights or cutting flights, moving flights around and things very quickly. What does this do? We always have this tension between airports and airlines over slots. Um, does this rationalization, if we use that term, does that are airports going to say, okay, well, you either fly it or you lose it? Are we seeing any of
Yes,
those? Are we seeing any of
yes.
those battles taking place?
So far, I think the industry understands the current situation, right? Everybody looks at the Middle East conflict as an acute situation. Suddenly we wake up on the morning of the 28th of February and then things start to unravel. Um, as we look at the current IATA summer season, right? You're right. The 80-20% slot utilization rules continue to apply, and that's why IATA has come out to ask for airports to reevaluate the current situation in light of of the fact that airlines sometimes is not of their is doing that they cannot fly, they cancel, and they have to disrupt their schedule simply because of the current situation. Sometimes it's because of the air routes, sometimes because there's not enough fuel, and so on. So to that extent, I'm glad to see some movement. I think on the UK and the European side, EU has come up with some guidelines to allow relief for the current season, and that's a welcome set of news for carriers, so they don't have to be too worried. But I think a lot of this depends on certain airports. It's not all airports in the world that are that have such a high demand. So it all depends. Um, I think if the current problems continue, we would likely require perhaps more airports to, examine this 80-20 slot rules, and perhaps take the guidance that the IATA has put out, and to see whether it's possible to provide, a waivers, at least for the season, and then I think reevaluate as we get closer to the winter.
Okay. Quick question on back on fuel, since that's taken up a lot of time here in the first half of the show. And I always ask people this. I was talking to a guy from a leasing company the other day, and he said, you can't buy a 737 or an A320 for love or money these days. A plane that's actually exists and not an order for 10 years from now. And I asked him about sustainability, and he said they don't care what engine it has or whether it burns SAF. He said they want the plane. Is this is this time now with jet fuel going? I mean, everybody. You talked about the spread a little bit ago. Is this an SAF moment, a sustainable aviation fuel moment, or does that not even figure into the fuel equation right now, price
Uh, I
wise?
would say I would say it's a different time horizon that we're looking at. Right now, airlines, like as I mentioned, very operationally driven, day by day, week by week, deciding the routes that they need to, fly or not fly. Um, but also, back of mind, consciously looking at the kind of costs, that airlines have to pay for jet fuel today, right? We certainly hope the jet fuel prices will come down sooner. But if these high prices, were to sustain, then yes, of course, the longer term solution for SAF, clearly provides an alternative. And I think airlines also, are probably hoping, and hopefully if they can plan, further down the road, SAF would clearly be, perhaps a more viable option in light, and it's all relatively, it's all relative when you compare prices, right? Today's fuel prices, 160, 180, 200. SAF, of course, is traditionally been higher, right? Three times higher on average. And then, of course, there can be an increase in supply for SAF's production. then maybe perhaps there can be some, consideration for risk diversification. But right now, I cannot say that, simply because, it's not a tap. You cannot turn on SAF and say, because fuel prices are so high today, jet fuel, I'm going to ask for SAF. Can you deliver tomorrow? That's not going to happen. So it's a more longer term solution, but I think it's important for the airlines to start or continue to invest in looking at these alternatives, and not being held hostage, so to speak, right? With the current fuel situation, it happens today, but who knows, how long, number one, it will last, and if it will it happen again.
Okay. Wong Hong, we need to take a quick break. We're going to pick up where we left off in just a minute, as soon as we hear from Responso Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're talking with Wong Hong. He's the newly installed, just getting his desk warm and organized and everything at the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines. He's the Director General. Let's talk about China very quickly, because the current occupant of the White House and the president of China, Xi Jinping, just finished meeting. Trump went to China, Boeing went to China. They got an order apparently for 200 jets. No details, no delivery estimates, we don't know if it's 777, we don't know if it's 777X, we don't know if it's, what kind of planes are being ordered. Interestingly, Boeing's stock price went down when Trump announced it. You've spent a lot of time in China. You were there, I think, for Delta when you were president of China for the airline. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Is this, I mean, I lived in Hong Kong. I've dealt with China and the Chinese. I've been to the foreign ministry office in Hong Kong. Very impressive building. Li Ka-shing apparently built it for China. Um, uh, is this one of these things where China just said, okay, yeah, we'll take 200 jets, and it may or may not materialize? Or is this something that they're kind of dangling out in front of the government? Maybe they're pushing for more concessions on trade or Taiwan or whatever. But I mean, to me, this just doesn't seem like a serious order, especially since Boeing hasn't said anything.
Well, thanks, Matt. That's a good question. If you look at just on the business side of things, right? China coming out of, COVID, probably the last big market to come out, and in the last 2 years, especially, they've expanded significantly, particularly in international routes. And clearly, they are trying to get back on track, which they pretty much have. You would look at the financial results of the Chinese carriers just this quarter, the first quarter, they all have started to turn, small profits, which is, a welcome relief. And that trajectory for China's growth will continue to happen. So what I'm trying to say is that, you would look at the expectation of demand from Chinese carriers to continue growing. So China as a market, both inbound and outbound, has that growth trajectory to translate into more jet planes required. So, and they are also very, very conscious on safety, which means that, they are also, all airlines in China will try to maintain their fleet to be pretty new, relatively speaking. That being said, so that's why if you ask this question about as far as industry demand is concerned, aviation demand, for Chinese carriers are concerned, plane orders definitely are needed. Now, the next question you're asking is, okay, is it going to come from Boeing, or is it come from Airbus, or maybe even Comac, right? And Comac has already started to fulfill some of that demand in the domestic markets for China. Of course, the attention and focus on Trump's visit, has been a lot on what deals could be made. So Boeing's CEO was also there, along with many other, CEOs. And this 200 plane, I think, was confirmed, right? Again, you say without details, but at least 200 planes are confirmed. I don't believe I think it's real. I wouldn't say it's not real, because the demand certainly requires, a lot more than actually just 200. So in fact, there could be even more orders, as what read in the press, that might come along. But again, a lot depends, because as you know, I think Boeing is probably U.S. Largest export, company, given the size of the cost of the planes, right? So it is a very significant signal between the two countries in relation to trade, and that obviously speaks to a much larger agenda. Now, I'm not in a position to speak on the political ambitions or the tactics that are being adopted between the two countries. But suffice to say, from the business standpoint, right, I think the 200 planes clearly will be needed further down the road. As to when they will be actually deployed or actually be ready for delivery, and that just adds to the supply chain problems that we all are very, very familiar with.
Yep. Let's talk about the other elephant in the room, literally speaking, is India. India's got, I love India. I've been there many, many times. It's a great country. You just have to embrace the chaos a little bit, it can be a chaotic place. And I've flown Air India a long time ago, which was, I mean, it was not great then. It's still a drag on Singapore Airlines earnings. Singapore has a stake in it. Indigo is going to have a new leader soon, Air India too, or Indigo does have a new leader with Willie Walsh coming in. But it seems like India is not moving ahead. I mean, there's all this potential there for MRO, for example. I mean, you've got a lot of skilled technicians. It could be a really big industry, but the government policies haven't always kept pace. They would tax certain parts or importation or this or that. What do you think? What can India do to improve aviation's outlook there? And do you have any insight on Air India and Singapore Airlines and who's going to be leading that one anytime soon?
Thanks. It's a great question. Well, I must say I've just come off from China, so I haven't paid that much attention India in the last few years. But suffice to say, given the trajectory and growth that has happened, you just look at some of the fundamentals there, right? I mean, economic growth has been pretty steady. The last 2 years was like 7%, 7.5%, and even this year projections are still at about 6%, and they're still growing at a decent clip. And that translates, of course, right, to better affordability from the end consumers and travelers. Travelers being travelers, once you hit a certain level of income, in the middle class, the desire to travel is going to be there. So domestic, has really grown significantly. International routes, have also stepped up. Simply to try and satisfy the demand from India. So they are on a good trajectory. I would say the trend is also very encouraging. Of course, we all know about the fuel crisis and the situation in the Middle East, and the Middle East represents a fairly significant market, right, for India. And it would have some impact for sure, a negative impact on the Indian market. But if I look beyond that, I mean, you look at the business potential and the growth I would say in the medium to long term, certainly they are continuing to grow. So that spells very positive signals on the demand side of things. Now, on the supply side, I mean, doing business in India, I mean, a lot of people who've been to India and understanding and working in India recognizes there are costs, and then, as in all countries, some are more complicated, some are more straightforward. So India happens to have, probably more complex operating environment, and they are also faced with airlines operating there. Are faced with different levels of costs, right, that are added. But having said that, the current fuel crisis that I've noticed, that has obviously dented many airlines' projections. It's also something that I've seen that lately the Indian government is also paying some attention and trying to alleviate the situation. So they're stepping in to try and manage some of these costs. The significant component is the air turbine fuel cost, which is obviously being applied, to the carriers, and they're capping some of these levels. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but as I understand it, there's some relief also for landing and parking, at least for a few months, and so on. So there are some measures that the governments are also trying to take to help manage the situation, because it is true. I mean, if you look at the estimates from fuel, the spike in fuel today, at least in the Indian market, it's not just 30%. I would say 30% would be on average, but in India, it's more acute. So as a proportion, the fuel cost translates to something like 40, even up to in the mid 40s in terms of percentage of operating costs. So it is a very significant headwind as far as Indian carriers are concerned. So to see the government stepping in and help, I think is a welcome, move. And I highly encourage even more dialogue, because they're, behind it, I think there are many other costs that perhaps more engagement and dialogue can hopefully, uncover, and better solutions can be thought. Because we don't want to, fall into a situation, because airlines, as I say already, right, they're very operating on very thin margins. And Indian carriers also, have not posted some are posted solid results, some are not so great. So it all depends on the financial situation and the balance sheet of carriers as well. If you fall into a situation where you start to get concerned about cash flow, then that's a problem we want to avoid. And so that's where I'm highly encouraged, governments, not just in India, but I think, all across in Asia Pacific, to pay close attention and to see, to make sure that perhaps, I would still call this a unique situation, as far as the fuel crisis is concerned, to try and help airlines, get over this hump, and then hopefully in a matter of weeks, months, if we can get some relief and some stability, from the oil supplies coming out from the Straits of Hormuz, then things will be, back on a more stable operating condition.
Okay. I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions on a couple of different topics, but ones that are really pertinent today. AI automation. I have a real love-hate relationship with computers and technology. On the one hand, if you look at my office, I've got a backup computer over there. I've got 3 screens here. I've got 2 network drives. I've got a podcast. So, I love computers. I love what they can do. AI scares me. I've got a son to put through university and I need my job. So AI bothers me a little bit, although I do use it from time to time, and I'm teaching myself about it. Asian airports especially are working on automation in a lot of ways. Go to Singapore Airport, they do it right, with the, sort of the automated gates that you go through for immigration and all of that. Cambodia, actually, where I'm based, with the new airport here, same thing. I think it's the same system, maybe from CETA or something like that. That's just not going to stop. This progression of biometrics and all of that, that's just going to continue, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think right across the entire scope of the airlines business, right? AI is certainly, is going to be increasingly being adopted. Um, if you look, as you say, I think, first of all, you talk about the customer, and the customer experience is something, if it can help the customer's experience, why not? So that's why you would see many airlines, jumping on the bandwagon, trying to improve the way they engage customers, whether they use AI to analyze, tons of data. Airlines have, no shortage of data actually, but how do you translate to useful intelligence, useful information, right, to serve the customer in a better way? Whether in call centers, you can summarize the calls, so that the agents who are answering the calls can really focus on the customer care. When you talk about loyalty programs, can be more creative in giving more targeted offers and so on. That's on the commercial space, and even for operating the carrier, right? You look at the things like dynamic pricing, revenue management. These will all be in the commercial space that you can see a lot of the AI, that's going to be adopted. Even in the technical side of things, right? Maintenance of aircraft, predictive maintenance to actually help carriers be better to watch out for failures on engines so that their engines can become more reliable. And the whole spectrum. So you can tell and you can see for sure, safely say that, these AI adoption and technologies will certainly help make business easier to conduct between airlines and the customer, make the operations better. Now, if you ask me whether it translates to, a loss of jobs, I think it will create some loss of jobs, but it also creates new jobs. So, on one hand, but of course, the new jobs will require different skill sets. So I think what underlies, this transition and phase, which we cannot stop. I think it's a question of, job retraining, upskilling, labor force to be better able to handle. And you talk about airports as well. And certainly, if you look at the airports nowadays, automation is likely going to be, going to happen more and more in the next couple of years. And you see perhaps even, robotics being more and more adopted. So I'm not surprised. I think it's a welcome move. As long as it helps the airline become better at its business and become better at serving their customers.
Okay. Very quickly, we're running short on time here. Asian Airlines, I love flying first class, business class. I hate coach, uh, and all of that. And I've flown on some nice Singapore Airlines, my favorite airline. They had a great first class from I flew from Mumbai to Singapore in their suite that they had, which is I had a lot of miles, so I cashed them in, and it was great. Our Asian and we've seen a move. We've seen a lot of data coming out in the recent couple of years, even before COVID. The premium part of the cabin was really getting a lot more attention than maybe it used to. So now you've got the Middle East Airlines, Emirates, Qatar. They've put a lot of money into their business class offerings, the Q Suite, things like that. Lufthansa has just now announced that they're going to bring their Allegris interior to Singapore, starting on flights there. And very quickly, is the current cost climate with everybody worried about fuel and all that, is is that going to slow down refurbishments and cabin interior refresh? Is that going to slow down the premium offerings that some Asian airlines want to put in?
I think right now, if you ask any of the carriers' leadership, I don't think they're pausing on any front. I mean, everyone's, of course, very focused on the current fuel crisis, and everyone's hoping, that this situation, would not be too prolonged. Um, of course, if things take a turn for the worse, into the next 3, 6 months up to the end of the year, then it's very hard to tell. But right now, I don't believe the airlines are going to cut back, in terms of their premium investments, simply because why they have done so. Premium investments cost a lot of money and they take time. So if they do these, if you see, as you mentioned, the example of some of these airlines already investing, it's an indication because they already anticipate the demand. And the demand is clearly also coming from the rising affluence, right, of travelers and requiring and wanting. You may want to say also it could be one factor could be also the rise of a newer generation of travelers who are prepared to pay for these premiums, right, for their travel. So, if you walk into a cabin nowadays, I can tell you, 20 years ago and now, they can be quite different. The demographics and profile of the people sitting in the business class has changed. I can tell you that. In the early days, we would see at least 70% of them would be business travelers, 80% business travelers. Today is not. Today is a mix. So again, this speaks to the demand, right, for the front cabins, and it gives encouragement certainly for carriers to say, yes, there is this market that we need to serve. If we don't serve, then somebody else will do it. So I think that kind of explains and justifies why my belief is that I think the premium supply and the premium demand are likely to be sustained.
Yeah, when I upgraded my son the first time he flew, I mean, he was born in Hong Kong, raised in Singapore, lived in Cambodia.
Yeah.
Now he's going to university in France. And so we've done, our fair share of traveling. And first time I upgraded him to business class, he said, "Yeah, Dad, this is great." So anytime he can score an upgrade, he's happy. Wong
Yes.
Wong Hong, let's talk about you very quickly. Last two things. You've had roles all over Asia, China. We talked about you were there. You've been in India, Thailand, Vietnam. Uh, you were with SATS in Singapore, big ground handler, food catering company. I had a chat with them a long time ago. I need to get them back on the schedule. For coming in as the new DG for the association, what's at the top of your agenda?
Well, AAP has been around for a long time. I mean, this is the 60th year that AAP is going to celebrate, 60 years. When we have our annual meeting coming up in the second half of the year. So as you can tell, the association representing the Asian carriers' interests clearly has many priorities that are still, continuing. I take over from Subhash, who has, done an excellent job, in stepping up and supporting, some of the goals, particularly in the last few years as the airlines have come out of COVID. But coming out of COVID, one of the key priorities that has really emerged is, this lack of aircraft, right? Supply chain, is a real problem, and the backlog is really hasn't really improved, if you like. I mean, we're talking about some estimates that 17,000, and pre-COVID was like 12,000 only. So if anything, it's gotten worse. So supply chain and the availability of the right planes continues to be an area of focus for us. I would like to work closely, of course, with the stakeholders, the OEMs, and their suppliers also, for us to better understand. And then at the last Assembly of Presidents in Bangkok, we actually had them together, and then there were some good exchanges on looking at not just identifying the problem, but looking at the solutions, right? We want to be on the same side and saying, how do we look at better solutions? How can we find faster ways? And I see some, movements and indications stepping up of training of skilled labor, because that was a big gap after when COVID happened. So a priority on supply chain surely is something that we will continue. The other one is sustainability, and I think we talk a little bit about the fuel crisis and the alternatives. Those remain very, very important for the Asia Pacific carriers. as part of a responsible industry. And in our part of the world, we still have this 5% SAF goal by 2030, which we're still continuing to shoot for. So this, broadly speaking, of course, the other one that's always going to be there, it's safety. We've been around, the airline industry has been around for a long time, right? And yet, even as we speak, with all the technologies and everything, safety still cannot be taken for granted. You cannot take it off the table. There's so many, areas and factors as airplanes operate, how to make sure, that we fly planes, and fly our customers safely, to their destinations.
Okay. Last question, and then I'll let you go back to work and do all that. Get the crystal ball out, and next 6 months, next year, what are Asian carriers going to be seeing? Hopefully, no
I would
war.
say, I think we need to be really careful here. The situation in the Middle East is very dynamic, and it can have repercussions, on the carriers. Of course, we already seen one casualty in terms of the bankruptcy of Spirit Airlines. We don't want to see, more of that anywhere, not just Asia Pacific, but anywhere. But in order to do so, I think a lot depends on the factors emerging out from, the Middle East. If the conflict continues, I think we're going to in for a pretty challenging period for the second half. But even if things stabilize, I think fuel costs will continue to be a major point of contention in terms of headwinds and costs for the airlines. So as from a financial standpoint, I would say most of the airlines are not going to be, their projections are, obviously have to be more realistic for this year. But if things turn better and things stabilize, I think we can look forward to hopefully a quick recovery back to, where we need to be, and then continuing, momentum in 2027.
Okay. Wong Hong, Director General of the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines. Thanks for joining me in conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.